CreateAsyncThunk. Overview. A function that accepts a Redux action type, a string, and a callback function that should return a promise. It generates promise lifecycle action types based on the action type prefix that you pass in, and returns a thunk action creator that will run the promise callback and dispatch the lifecycle actions based on the return promise. This abstracts the standard recommended approach for handling async request lifecycles. It does not generate any reducer functions since it does not know what data you're fetching, how you want to track loading state, or how the data you return needs to be processed. You should write your own reducer logic that handles these actions with whatever loading state and processing logic is appropriate for your own app. And here's a tip. Redux Toolkit's RTK Query Data Fetching API is a purpose-built data fetching and caching solution for Redux apps and can eliminate the need to write any thunks or reducers to manage data fetching. We encourage you to try out and see if it can help simplify the data fetching code in your own apps, and you can check out this link if you want. So here they're giving us an example of the Redux/toolkit. So if we go into the terminal, if you have a project, I'm gonna go here. I have a project, so it's gonna be Redux. So it's gonna be cd or Redux like this. I'm gonna cd and I have a folder named test like that. And let me see. Okay, node public. So now I'm gonna open it with Visual Studio Code. I'm gonna type code space that, and yeah, this is the folder that we worked in the previous video. So in the dependencies I have Redux.js/toolkit, I have React, I have Redux, React-Redux. And if we go to the counter slice, as you can see, we are importing CreateAsyncThunk and CreateSlice from @Redux.js/toolkit. And we have also the initial state, but here in this example they are also importing CreateAsyncThunk and CreateSlice from @Redux.js/toolkit, and they are also importing the user API from the that/user API. Here in our folder test, instead of user API we have the fetch count, and we are importing it from that/counter API. So we have this file here, counter API.js. So we have a JavaScript file that is a Mac function to mimic making an asynchronous or an async request for data. So that is that. And what else they're doing here? First of all, they are creating the thunk. So we have this variable name fetch user by ID, and we are setting it to CreateAsyncThunk. And inside of the parentheses we have this argument, we have this string that is going to be users/fetch by ID status, and then we're going to have an asynchronous function that is going to be asynchronous. It's going to have two arguments, user ID set to number, and then the thunk API. And in the curly braces we are going to have this variable name response that we are going to await, since this is asynchronous, and we're going to await for the user API that fetch by ID, and we're passing in the user ID, and then we're going to return this variable, the response that data, and data is an object like that. Then in the syntax we're going to have the interface user state, and in the curly braces we're going to have this object with properties. Entities is going to be set to empty brackets, and loading is going to be set to this string idle or pending or succeeded or false. And this is the or logical operator or the vertical bar. Then we have the initial state, and it's set to an object with properties. So entity set to empty brackets, loading is set to a string idle, and this is as user state. We have then handle actions and your reducers. So we have the user slice that is set to CreateSlice, And inside of the parentheses, we're going to have an object with properties name set to users or the string users, the initial state. Then we have the reducers that is going to be set to an empty set of curly braces, a standard reducer logic with auto-generated action types per reducer. Then we have the extra reducers, and we have the arrow function that is taking builder as the argument, and then we're going to have builder.addCase. Add reducers for additional action types here and handle loading state as needed. So in the parentheses, we're going to have the fetch user by ID that fulfill, and then the arrow function that is going to take state and action as arguments. And then in the curly braces, we're going to have the state.entities.push, and we're going to push the action.payload. Later, dispatch the thunk as needed in the app. So we're going to dispatch it using dispatch. In the parentheses, we're going to pass in the fetch user by ID and then some number here, 1, 2, 3. The parameters. CreateAsyncThunk accepts 3 parameters: a string action type value, a payload creator callback, and an options object. So let's check out the type. A string that will be used to generate additional Redux action type constants representing the lifecycle of an async request. For example, a type argument of, in single quotes, users/request status will generate these action types: pending, fulfill, and rejected. Pending, so in single quotes here, users/request status/pending. Fulfill is gonna be users/request status/fulfill, and then rejected, users/request status/rejected. Now we're gonna see the payload creator, a callback function that should return a promise containing the result of some asynchronous logic. It may also return a value synchronously. If there is an error, it should either return a rejected promise containing an error instance, or a plain value such as the scripted error message, or otherwise a result promise with a rejected with value, rejected or reject with value argument, as returned by the Thunk API that reject with value function. The payload creator function can contain whatever logic you need to calculate an appropriate result. This could include a standard AJAX data fetch request, multiple AJAX calls with the results combined into a final value, interactions with React Native, async storage, and so on. The payload creator function will be called with 2 arguments. We have the arguments, the arg, a single value containing the first parameter that was passed to the Thunk action creator when it was dispatched. This is useful for passing end values like items IDs that may be needed as part of the request. If you need to pass in multiple values, pass them together in an object which you dispatch the Thunk, like dispatch and then fetch users. And inside of the parentheses, we're gonna have this object with the status column set to active. Then we're gonna have sort by and then set the string name. Then we're gonna have the Thunk API, and the Thunk API is an object containing all of the parameters that are normally passed to a Redux Thunk function, as well as additional options. Dispatch, the Redux store dispatch method. We have the getState, the Redux store getState method, extra, the extra argument given to the Thunk middleware on setup if available, request ID, a unique string ID value that was automatically generated to identify this request sequence. We have the signal, and a board controller, that signal object that may be used to see if another part of the app logic has marked this request as needed cancellation. We have the reject with value that has value meta. Reject with value is a utility function that you can return or throw in your action creator to return a rejected response with a defined payload, or in meta it will pass whatever value you give it and return it in the payload of the rejected action. If you also pass in a meta, it will be merged with the existing reject action that meta. And finally we have the fulfill with value, and we pass in the value meta. Fulfill with value is a utility function that you can return in your action creator to fulfill with a value while having the ability of adding to fulfill action that meta. The logic and the payload creator function may use any of these values as needed to calculate the result. So we're going to check out options. An option with the following optional fields. So we have the condition, we have the argument, we have the get state, extra, and then the boolean. A callback that can be used to skip execution of the payload created in all action dispatches if desired. See the cancellation before execution for a complete description, so you can check out this link. We have the dispatch condition rejection. If condition returns false, the default behavior is that no actions will be dispatched at all. If you still want a rejected action to be dispatched when the thunk was cancelled, set this flag to true. ID generated, so we have the argument here, stream, a function to use when generating the request ID for the request sequence. Defaults to use nano ID, but you can implement your own ID generation logic. Serialize error, so we have the error unknown and then set to any. To replace the internal mini serialize error method with your own serialization logic, we have here get pending meta, and we have the argument and the request ID, we have the get state and the extra, and then any. A function to create an object that will be merged into a pending action field. And finally we have return value. CreateAsyncThunk returns a standard Redux Thunk function creator. The Thunk action creator function will have plain action creators for the pending, fulfill, and rejected cases attached as nested fields. Using the fetch user by ID example above, CreateAsyncThunk will generate 4 actions. Here, fetch user by ID, the Thunk action creator that kicks off the asynchronous payload callback you wrote. We have the fetch user by ID that pending, an action creator that dispatches the users slash fetch by ID status slash pending action. Then we have the fetch user by ID that fulfill, an action creator that dispatches users slash fetch by ID status slash fulfill action. We have the fetch user by ID that rejected, an action creator that dispatches users slash fetch by ID status slash rejected action. When dispatched, the Thunk will dispatch the pending action, call the payload creator callback, and wait for the return promise to settle. When the promise settles, if the promise resolves successfully, dispatch the fulfill action with the promise value as action payload. If the promise resolves with a reject with value, passing the value, return value, dispatch the rejected action with the value passed into action.payload and rejected as action.error.message. If the promise failed and was not handled with reject with value, dispatch the rejected action with a serialized version of the error value as action.error. Return a fulfill promise containing the final dispatch action, either the fulfill or rejected action object.